Action.
Hi.
Hello.
Take one.
Okay, so obviously we're new to StreamYard, but we're making it work. It's cute. We're here to do this chat. Sherronda, this was like, well, I know it's kind of like a all of us idea type of thing, but I'm glad that you like agreed to hop on here and like host this because I think you're perfect for it, even though I know you're like a little nervous.
It's okay. I got my stress ball. We're gonna be fine. Okay. Yeah, it's just two friends sitting in a room having a conversation. It's fine.
It's true.
Cool. Okay. I mean, I have a list of questions for you, but I still want this to be a like informal and fun conversation, even though we're going to talk about some things that are not so fun. Right. But we're going to make it fun. So first, thank you for writing the book.
Thank you for reading it and for writing a blurb for the book. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I sometimes forget that I did that, but I'm so glad that I did.
Your name is right in the
book. But it's just, I mean, and I know a lot of people agree, it's just, it's a beautiful offering. And I'm so glad it exists in the world. And so just thank you for writing it, for birthing it from your brain. And also thank you for inviting me to come and talk with you about it.
No.
I'm very honored.
You were perfect for it. I literally used some of your work with Warrior Voice, of course, in the book. So I don't know if you know that or not. You probably didn't read the index, but yeah, some of your...
Oh, no, I definitely did not read the index. I was like, I don't want to citate it.
I don't want to read all of this. Well, yes, you are like literally all through the book. So.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. I'm going to go read the index later tonight.
Okay.
Like a nerd, but it's fine. Well, aside from my blurb that's on the book, I haven't given you like my initial reflection of the book overall. And like, as I was reading it, what I was thinking about the most is this question that I've heard you ask several times, which is like, who are you outside of your body? And it's one of my favorite questions that has ever been asked, ever. And I like watching people react to that question and process it because I think it always generates productive conversations and also like very interesting conversations about the body and what the body holds and what it refuses to hold and what it cannot hold and what it fails to hold because it's not supposed to. And the things it's not meant to carry, but we often expect it to carry anyway. And we put these unfair and unnecessary expectations on our bodies, which inevitably leads to disappointment and disorder.
Right.
And I think that what you drive home with Belly of the Beast, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but I know you well enough to know that it probably was intentional. You drive home why that question is such an important one, because, I mean, the long and short of it is that the state does not want us to know ourselves outside of our body.
Right.
Specifically, it does not want us to know ourselves outside of how our bodies are useful to the state. How they're consumable and how they're disposable. And then there are like entire systems and corporations that are invested in us only seeing ourselves as a body and as a thing to be measured and evaluated and categorized. Yep. So that was one of the things I took away from the book, and that was just on my mind as I was reading it. So
no,
I couldn't write that blurb.
You did write the blurb.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't write all of this in my blurb because I was like, let me not write an entire essay as a response. But I wanted to say that at least.
No, I really, really, really appreciate that. And that question, I forget like which chapter I was writing when I tweeted that question, but I was like in the process of writing that whatever chapter it was, I would just remember thinking like, what the fuck? Like how do we even start to like imagine what we can even be outside of like this flesh bag, this thing we're born
Right.
into that gets named and gendered and assigned and like all of that. And it's like um the more you think about it, like you said, like and the more you realize just how much the state does not have an interest in you knowing who you are. Like I think the other day I was watching this show called Atypical, which I know some folks have critiques of, but it's good TV if you ask me. Um, and I was watching it, and it's a show about this white family, but this
Mhm.
white boy named Sam who is autistic, and he like was sitting with this assignment that he had to do for class, where they were basically asking him to like um, come up with the essence of a thing, like to describe the essence of his favorite thing, which is penguins. And he was like struggling. He was like, my penguin, like it does this and it does that, and it moves at this time, and its schedule is like this sort of thing. And the teacher, the professor is like, this is what the penguin does, but like, what is its essence? And like, it just reminded me of this exact question where I'm like, our bodies, they move, they morph, they shift, we do things with them, we show up with them, we like they do hold things that they shouldn't have to hold, that they can't hold, like you said. And they have all these assignments, but like, who are you? Like, how important are you to the conversation? What do you bring outside of your physical self that allows for you to find value in who you are outside of the labor you perform, or outside of the like a labor assigned to you, depending on what your body like presents as. And so I really do love that question, and it's one that I'm always like asking myself, just sitting with in this like moment where I feel I'm experiencing something that is, you know, very important, you know, putting out a book and having all these conversations in different spaces, but needing to offer more than just my like my physical self, and also needing to offer more than just my mental self. Like, who am I
Mhm.
outside of what makes up this body? So I'm glad that that's a question that resonates with you, because it's one of my favorite questions too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so one of my first questions for you,
Okay.
which may or may not be difficult for you to answer, I don't know, is what did you learn while you were writing this book? And did you learn anything new about yourself?
So I think the biggest thing I learned about myself in the process of writing this book is, one, that I can do it. I've always like thought about writing like something longer, and just like putting the ideas in this book have been something that I've held for a long time, but I never imagined myself like actually being able to publish, I guess. Um, and I mean, like you and Laura both know this, having been like my editor since 2017. I like still struggle with having confidence in my writing, despite how many people enjoy the writing. So I'm like, I don't know if this is ever going to be a thing
Mhm.
that I'm going to do, but I did it, and like the fact that I did it in the middle of 2020, which was such a hectic year, was like, um, to me, felt like a huge accomplishment, because for one, I was at that time working two jobs. I was organizing around COVID and around the like police violence that was happening, like trying to find different ways to do all of the things that I was doing while also trying to finish this book. And it was difficult. It was like really hard to try to compartmentalize, to try to like create room for and prioritize things, or figure out what is priority and what's not priority, and all of that, especially when everything presents as a very important moment. And then, of course, experiencing like depression and anxiety around the changing world and the way that we're like navigating this bullshit. So it was it was like very,
Right.
very hard. But once I got to October, and the end date kept moving for me. Like at first it was August, then it was September, and then I didn't finish it till October. But once I got to October, I was like, okay, I wrote it. Like I wrote a book. I did it. Finished. And so that was like the biggest thing that I learned was just that I can actually do it, and that I'm like capable, I guess, of not folding under pressure, which is something that I'm used to. I think everything about life, especially for Black folks, is pressure, but I think that's a different type of pressure that I hadn't experienced. But then I also learned, like, I know like people walk away with sort of good takeaways from what they learned, but I also learned that I struggle a lot with with putting concepts on paper. I think like writing this book and trying to like reach word counts and word limits was like really difficult for me, because once I've said what I said, I don't have anything else to add. I'm like, I said what I said, and that's it. And they're like, okay, but we need a little bit more. And I'm like, I don't have more to give you. So like, it was like a struggle. And at some points, I remember like taking like 2-3 weeks, like with no writing on the book. And I was like, beat myself up every single night. Like, oh my God, how am I not writing right now? But I was like, I don't have anything else to say. So I would like have to go back and read things over again, or find like something that like had piqued my interest that sort of got me thinking, so that I could go back to finally finish writing the book. But it was really hard. So I definitely learned that I struggle with getting things onto paper, because once my thoughts feel fleshed out for me, that's the end of it. Like the third thing that I've really learned about myself in this process is just that there are still things about my body that I'm still learning about, that I'm still figuring out. And reading and doing new research to finish this book was like an eye opener for me, because like I had done a lot of reading on all the things, and that's why I knew that I should write this book, because all that I had read had not reflected what I wanted to write. But I still was like finding like different things to sort of internalize about my relationship to my body, or different things that sort of explained why I had a specific relationship to my body, or why I was engaged by doctors in a particular way, or why I had this experience as a child or that experience as a young adult. And well, I guess I'm still a young adult, whatever. And
right, I wasn't going to say nothing. I was like,
okay. But like it taught me like a lot about like experiences that perhaps I buried and like didn't and hadn't thought through anymore, because they were like traumatic experiences, but also experiences that I didn't have language for. And being able to find language to explain some of those things was like, I think, really affirming for me. So those, if I had to like just give it 3 things, those are definitely 3 things that I learned about myself, and also that I learned like just about like my relationship to my body.
Okay. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of the actual book. So this is a book that is about both anti-Blackness and anti-fatness. And the subject that you cover in the book is the Black fat, and you use that language specifically, the Black fat. And I was wondering, what is the reason behind using this terminology instead of Black fat bodies or people? And what is it meant to name, and what's the work being done when you use it?
Yeah, I like this question because I use that language knowing that like it would be a big question for people. And I use the Black fat for the exact reason that you name, which is that like I'm referring to subjects. And I think of the Black fat as like an entity, or like a body, not as a singular person, or like not even as a group of people per se, but as like one large entity, right? So like when I'm referring to the Black fat, I'm naming sort of in a way like, or it would be referenced in the same way you would reference like an industry or something to that extent. And the idea is to sort of like separate or be clear rather about the fact that the Black fat is subjugated. It is a subject. It's not intended, and nor were Blackness or fatness ever created with the intention to sort of like humanize or create space for the humanity of the Black fat subject. And so it sort of is like another way of naming that that. Or I guess it's a more precise way for me of naming our subjugation and objectification without having to name subjugation and objectification throughout every time I use that language, with the hopes that I can like sort of be honest and clear about the ways that I think, as like Sakia Aman Jackson would name, like the ways that we are given access to and removed from humanity simultaneously, and what the consequences of that is.
Yeah, I think that you demonstrate that intention pretty well, but I just, for people who might not pick it up, I just wanted to go ahead and ask that question. And closely related to that is like when you write this book and you were talking about the Black fat, you make a point of focusing specifically on Black fat mask bodies and people. And what opportunities are presented by focusing specifically on Black fat and mask people rather than Black fat people as a whole?
I know, I love this question too. So I've been reading a lot of like fat studies, a lot of Black studies texts, a lot of women, gender, sexuality studies text, and like in different ways, they're either really hyper focused on white folks, cis folks, or heterosexual folks, and generally outside of fat studies, always on thin folks. And so like, it was important for me to, I guess, write something that I think more accurately like reflected the experience of fat Black, like trans mass folks in particular, non-binary mass folks, and then of course like cis men who oftentimes I think are removed from conversation when it comes to anti-fatness in the way that it relates to anti-Blackness. And so I wanted to offer something to like the gender studies conversation that gave room, and the trans studies conversation that sort of gave room to acknowledge the violence that quote unquote mask folks and mask bodies are experiencing because of their fatness and their Blackness. And I think that the idea is, if we can be honest about the prevalence of the violence that we're seeing on our TV screens, and name that part of that is because of the way that particularly cishet men are propelled to the forefront because of their maleness and because of patriarchy, but also acknowledging that they are also experiencing some sort of violence, and then adding on top of that it's especially true for trans men, trans mass folks, and non-binary folks who are read as these beasts in a particular way. If we can like be honest about those two things and sort of apply the nuance that allows for both those things to be true, then we can like, therefore, I think, be more honest in our work around gender, around fatness, around Blackness, and around transness in particular. And so for me, it just, I felt like what I was really doing was sort of bridging a gap between Judith Butler's work, Sabrina String's work, and Snorton's work from Black on Both Sides. I think like while of course there being mention of Zakia Amon Jackson, Horton Spillers, Sabia Hartman, etc. I think like all of them have done really groundbreaking work and have been like key to sort of producing work in like those particular fields individually or separately. And I wanted to do something that created a space that like brought all those things together and that acknowledged that in so many ways the way that Black trans masc folks are lumped in with this cis het in particular like way of being, while not acknowledging the nuances in the way that they show up in the world, is dishonest and also transphobic and sort of removes like there being any sort of theory or analysis around their experiences and then our experiences as non-binary masc presenting people. And I'm using that very loosely because I don't even know what those words mean, but and I don't think anybody else does either. But like it was important for me to be able to sort of bridge those gaps and then introduce a new lane that sort of allowed for trans folks in particular to have theory written around our experiences. And that is why I also wanted Kiese to write the foreword, because I think that what he did with Heavy was really brilliant and also really unheard of, especially in fat studies, because I mean, as you know, like fat studies is very cis white woman.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get Sabrina String's work, which is not mentioning trans people. It's around cis Black women in particular. And Roxanne Gay, who also is writing around cis Black women and her cis Black woman experience in particular. And so it was important for me that Sabrina Strings doing the groundbreaking work that she did and Kiese Lehman, who to me also did very groundbreaking work, were both part of this project, because I think my hope was that I was able to sort of bridge their two works together.
Yeah, and one of the ways that you do that is this focus on policing and prisons, and how that in particular targets Black men and Black masc folks. And you do this thing in chapter 4 that I haven't seen anybody else do, which is you tell the story of all these different police murders of Black folks, and you really lay out the timeline for us in a very clear way. And like I had never seen that timeline laid out like that before. And it was I think it was important to do that so we could see just how, like, at least for me, I don't think I have ever thought about how quick in succession all of those deaths came. From like Mike Brown through Tamir Rice, all the way down to George Floyd. And of course, you also cover Eric Garner, which both you and I have written about before. And just the way that their bodies and their gender both work to frame them as monstrosities in those moments and to justify, their deaths. And another thing that it really got me thinking of, that in juxtaposition with the rest of the book, is how fat phobia encourages us to police ourselves as well as to deprive ourselves. And you briefly mentioned diet culture, and you talk about how it's so similar to purity culture. And we've had this conversation before, right? About that deprivation and self-sacrifice is all very familiar to us. And I think it's also useful to talk about how diet and fitness culture and fat phobia are also the ugly cousins of capitalism and capitalistic ideology, especially that rise and grind rhetoric. And because that's also about celebrating and worshiping exploitation and self-sacrificial labor, and tirelessly working and laboring to achieve some unachievable end.
Right.
And it's for the benefit of other people, not necessarily for the benefit of you or for your body. And so we have to, as Black people especially, we have to constantly fall into line, or live in the crushing shame of not being able to fall in line with our bodies. And so we're not only essentially coerced into policing ourselves, we're also expected to punish ourselves. Literally. And then because fatness is already so punished by entire institutions in our society anyway, and agents of those institutions. And then on top of that, we provide more of those punitive consequences. And then that punitiveness just mirrors the policing and prison systems that we are hopefully trying to abolish. And so these things are never divorced from each other, and they're interconnected in so many different ways. And I think your book really demonstrates how many different connections there are between all of these things, and that we can't talk about one without the other, at least not talk about them in a way that's truly productive.
Right. That part especially because I think some people try to, but I don't think that every conversation is a productive conversation. But yeah, like I like that takeaway, because that was exactly my hope with chapter 4. It was like, I want to be clear about like just how close in time like all of these murders were, and all of them happened. I think like excluding George Floyd, the longest time apart from each murder was, or the longest time was 3 months. And I think that was with Walter Scott and Samuel DuBose, I think. But otherwise they were happening like every other month almost. Right. And it was like, and with the first 3, Eric, Mike, and Tamir, like they all happened literally in June or July, August, and then November of that year. And it's like, how are we even?
Yeah, trauma does it to you. You forget how many things.
It's like, it's so much. And when I sat down to like actually write it, because at first, initially the book was going to be solely about Eric Garner, and then I was like, I'm not going to do that, because I haven't worked with his family. I don't think that would be very fair to his family. So then I like sat and like went through the timeline, and I was like, this, like, I was in the thick of organizing around this. So I guess I never sat with just how close in proximity all of these things were happening, or close in time. And so like to sit and read through the timeline for everything, and then read all of their cases and write in details of their cases that oftentimes weren't publicized. It was like, this is a lot. But I think that was, when I first wrote the book, it's not anymore, but when I first wrote the book, that was my favorite chapter, because I got to talk about the way that Angela Davis sort of weaves in like, I guess the reform of prisons, and how prison itself is a reform from execution. And then like thinking through the violent ways then that like the criminal justice system itself is like predicated on anti-fatness. And then of course talking about Cook County in Chicago, Illinois, and the way that they did their things, which I won't talk about in detail, because folks will have to just read the book. But like, it was like, that chapter I think was one of, if not the hardest chapter for me to write, because it was like, this can be a book by itself. Like this whole chapter could be a book by itself, because they are like, they really got us fucked up. Like that's all I kept thinking to myself was, y'all got us fucked up. And it's hard.
Well, so now I have to ask, what is your favorite chapter?
I love this question, because I have a couple.
I think okay. I was going to guess. Guess chapter 5.
Is that with the obesity epidemic and the
war on drugs?
Actually, surprisingly, it's not my favorite chapter.
Oh, okay.
Favorite chapter, there's 2. The 3rd chapter on health, and
Oh,
the 6th chapter on
gender.
on gender.
Yeah.
Those are my 2 favorite chapters. The third one, because I just think that it, in my opinion, I don't think that that has been written before. Like this idea that health is something that was created with the very intention of
Right.
keeping Black folks out. Like I don't think that people have named that, and so writing that for me was like difficult because I was using all this theory to sort of like produce that conclusion, but the conclusion had not been made by anyone else. But that's also why I love it, because I'm like, well, I mean, again, I said what I said, so
Right.
like, and then the 6th chapter, because it, I think it's unusual or not very common to like have interviews in a book, or at least like books on theory. I've not really seen a lot of books that do that, and I was excited to be able to actually bring in other trans folks to talk about their experiences. That sort of like gives us quantitative or qualitative, I don't know, but one of those keywords,
Oh
data,
no.
that like that allows us to like sort of like have more data to support what we already know around
Yeah.
abolishing gender. But then in the beginning of that chapter and in the end, I really, really, really enjoyed being able to like write with Judith Butler and Spillers, like, and to be able to produce that. It was fun to like be reading through Mama's Baby Papa's Maybe and Gender Trouble or Gender Trouble, to be able to like come up with that, and some of Judith Butler's other works, to be able to like write that chapter. That was just a really fun moment. I remember writing it and thinking like, this is like the most fun I've actually had writing this book since I think the first chapter. So it was just fun to write. And also another conclusion that I was really happy about, because I'm like, yes, fuck gender.
Yes.
They get over this. So it was exciting.
Yeah.
I liked it.
Okay. So I'm glad you brought up chapter 3, because I want to jump back into that. Well, I guess it's a little bit chapter 3, a little bit chapter 4 as well, about the idea of a healthy body or preferred type of body, and also consumption or overconsumption, and that myth that gets placed onto fat bodies.
Right.
And like what's clear from your work and Sabrina Strange's work is that Black people will never have access to that standard. And you name that very clearly. And we'll never have access to that regardless, even if we are thin or conventionally beautiful or seemingly healthy, even if we check all the boxes.
Right.
Blackness will always be synonymous with what is considered ugly and undesirable and unclean and unhealthy, regardless of how our bodies appear to function. Under white supremacy, Black people are always going to be understood as gluttonous.
Yep.
And given to excess, regardless of whether or not there's food or sex or anything else, because they don't want us to have anything. And so any amount that we try to take is already too much.
Right.
And I think that this is my personal theory. So like, okay. I think that this myth of Black gluttony, which is also something that serves to align us with animality and monstrosity, of course. It does a particular kind of work in the white supremacist imagination. And one thing that white supremacy does, and it is so adept at doing, is projecting and deflecting.
Yep.
And that's my opinion on white supremacy. That's whiteness loves to project and deflect. And like, and I've written about this before, there's quite literally a history of white people consuming Black people and Black bodies for their own like various gratifications. And whiteness constantly finds new ways to cannibalize and consume.
Yep.
And colonialism itself was and is a continued form of consumption and cannibalism.
Right.
It devours everything in its path and leaves nothing but bones behind.
Everything,
Like,
literally.
and it continues to do that. It is like whiteness is eternally hungry. And that's why I personally find zombies and vampires to be the perfect monsters to talk about whiteness and white supremacy. And I'm going to do it forever. I don't care if people get sick of it. Get ready. But projecting monstrosity and overconsumption onto Black bodies and Black people is a way to deflect from the reality that whiteness is what is beastly.
Right.
And whiteness is what is monstrous.
Yep.
And that was my takeaway from chapter 3 and chapter 4. After I thought about them both together, I was like, yeah, it's projection and deflection.
It is. It's like I literally wrote like, well, the entire book was like put in, those chapters were written in that way on purpose, even though I wrote those chapters out of order. But like I placed them that way exactly because I think that they do go together. I think like specifically chapter 2, 3, and 4, like are all, they could have been all one big chapter because they weren't, because then I wouldn't have had a big enough book, but it could have been one big chapter because like they all coincide, and it literally is that, like, this idea that we are the ones to blame, like, for the way that we're engaged, for the way that our bodies are engaged, because we eat too much or overconsume, as if capitalism doesn't literally produce more than what it needs and doesn't give to people who actually need it.
Exactly.
Like, how are we to blame for that? Like, but it's like they don't, it doesn't matter because we're Black and we're fat, and it's like, y'all, obviously you are the reason for why there is scarcity. You're the reason for why purity and abstinence are important and why it's necessary, because without it, we produce people like you, people who are dirty, people who are unclean, people who are too fat and too unwell to ever exist amongst those of us who are normal and regular. But it's like, girl, okay, I'm just trying to like be in my bed. Can you relax? like, why you got to do all of that? Like,
right. And I was going to say, let me live, but like, that's the point. They don't want us to.
They don't want us, exactly. Like, that is the point.
But yeah, but it's like so contradictory. And this of course is also a feature of whiteness, that contradictory nature and that circular logic, and that they don't want us to live.
Yeah.
They don't want us to exist, but at the same time they need us to exist.
Exactly.
Because our existence is the only way that they find their imagined value. Versus imagined superiority. Yeah.
Like, that's literally Zakia Iman Jackson's like thesis for becoming human, where she's like, we're human insofar as we are amongst the bottom tier, which puts us in relationship to animals and animality, but we're also removed from humanness in that very same way. And it's like, they, like you said, they don't want us to live. They don't want us to be anything that is not slaves. But they also know that we have to have breath in our lungs, oxygen in our lungs, because that is the only way that we can produce labor. It's the only way that we can like perform labor on their behalf, while not being human enough to live, while not being human enough to actually be able to like to do more than just breathe. Right. I know where people like, Black Brunch Twitter is always talking about like thriving, not surviving, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I mean, that's a cute thought, but the idea is that we don't thrive, because then that makes us human, and to make us human to mean that we can be something other than slaves. But then that means that capitalism doesn't exist, and that means that anti-Blackness doesn't exist, but it does. So yeah, like I think that is the perfect takeaway from those two chapters in particular, 3 and 4, because it's like, if the first like documented source of the medical industry or disability in this way is through the creation of these two mental illnesses that essentially allow you to be on your property for deciding that they like are human enough to not have to be your property anymore.
Right.
what else do you expect me to like take away from that? Like, how else can we? What other conclusion can we come to besides the fact that you're creating things literally to make sure that we don't get to exist amongst you and the regular folk?
Yeah. So there's this quote that I really like from this philosopher called C. Wright Mills, and I can't remember what book this is from, but he basically says that white supremacy is an agreement to misinterpret the world. And basically, whiteness will always validate its own lies and then punish the rest of us if we don't adhere to the false reality that it has created. And Dropotomania is such a good example of that, because if the slave runs away from the plantation because they recognize and understand themselves as belonging to themselves and not belonging to a white master, then they have to be made into a lunatic. They have to be made into an insane person because they refuse to adhere to the law that they are property.
Like,
and like this, right, and also this continued after chattel slavery.
Literally.
Like after the Civil War, a lot of Black people were forced into mental institutions and declared insane. And a lot of the documents for what they have listed as the reason for their insanity is freedom.
Yeah. It literally, and I think that I think that like that is still playing a role in the way that like in particular Black children are engaged today, like Black children with ADHD or Black children who just typically are just hyper and feel free in being like their hyper selves, are engaged as if they're like bad or need like behavioral correction. And it's like, a person might need assistance. They don't need to be corrected for having a condition or disability. And also, like, being bad is not a disability. Like,
it's not.
So labeling it as if it is, to then punish them for existing in a way that is, you know, like unbecoming to you, then it's like, this is literally to me a continuation of exactly that. And it doesn't leave room for allowing Black kids and Black people, because I think a lot more Black adults have ADHD than they realize. Like,
yeah, ADHD content really be kicking my butt. Like, I haven't been diagnosed, but every time I see something from a Black woman with ADHD, even though, you know, I'm not really a Black woman, every time I see it, I'm like, man, okay, you are very loud.
No, literally. I feel like that with like autism. Like, it just is very like, the more I read and like study, I'm like, this feels so much more related to me than you could possibly understand. Like, I really feel that, and like having like these experiences and being able or attempting to try to like live freely within that experience while looking different than what is considered normal or whatever, literally leads to your punishment. It literally leads to you like being beaten and wounded and forced to work in the fields under the sun, the blazing sun, after you've been beaten and had water poured all over you because you decided to be free in yourself. And it's just like unimaginable to me, like that this is an experience that Black folks have had from the beginning. And that's why I like had to write that, because I'm like, I don't think that we really think about the fact that that is the beginning. That's the origin story for the medical industry. Like in the West, in America in particular, but in the West in general, like that is how we get to this moment. And if that's the case, then nothing that we do is going to satisfy our need to be healthy, because there's no way for us to be.
Right. And I think we could have a whole entire another conversation about neurodivergence and disorder and dysfunction, and how those things are determined by a standard that is set by white supremacy. But we only have a few minutes. And before we end, I want one last question. is about body positivity. Of course, you had to bring it up in the book, so I have to bring it up here. Of course, you want to direct us away from body positivity and more towards body liberation. And I was wondering if you think that those two things can coexist, or is body positivity inherently antithetical to body liberation?
The girls were trying to eat me up for this, but I don't care. I don't think that they can coexist. I think that I remember, and I'm sure you do too, like a few years ago, like the public discourse, especially on Twitter, was like body positivity was created by Black women to blah, 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 blah. But it never shifted us anywhere because people still held on to this idea that body positivity is for everyone. And that kind of sort of like, and I use that too. Like, so I'm not placing blame on anyone because I said the same thing. And in a way, it's true, but Black women didn't create body positivity. What was created was like a fat liberationist politic and like a fat acceptance politic. And collapsing that with body positivity, which has been used continuously as a way to like produce some sort of positive feelings for people who are always already celebrated in the world anyway. Only I think like reifies the very same violence that we're talking about trying to get away from. So to me, if we are invested in body liberation, if we're invested in body neutrality, if we're invested in fat acceptance, fat neutrality, fat liberation, whatever you want to name it, there's no way like to also be quote unquote body positive, because one requires that you center and prioritize the experiences of fat people, and the other requires that you center and prioritize the experiences of everyone who is not fat. And I don't think people want to name that, but when you see body positivity online, you only see it in reference to like people who are not fat. And for those who are, there's a very different relationship to the way that people respond to us than there is to others, right? And like I was mentioning before we got on this call, like there like was this article written about this white man from TikTok whose entire TikTok identity is around being body positive, but his entire page is dedicated to his weight loss journey. And he's using captions like, it's not where you start, it's just as long as you start, or it's not where you start, it's where you go, and blah, 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 as if to indicate that there has to be like another side in order for us to like be experiencing liberation or be like being able to like live freely in the bodies that we exist in. And they wrote an entire article on this white man and like calling him like the sort of pinnacle of the new age perfect man, like having this understanding that for if there is a perfect man or if there is a perfect man, like he is the one that's reshaping the way we see that. And he's the one that's reshaping the way that they show up. And I'm like, this is literally a cis white man who is thin and just doesn't have chiseled abs. I want all of you to give me a break. Like this is the shining example of exactly what like Eurocentric, like body politics have always been, but somehow he's like the shining example. And so I think like that to me is just the perfect example of like the ways that body positivity doesn't make room and cannot make room for fat liberation, even to the point that like there are people who look like him that have pages like him that are Black who didn't get that like sort of recognition. Not that they should have, because they still would not be whatever, but it's like the very fact that you consider this white man over any other Black person who looks like him, who's also body positive, is only to me an example of the way that for one, Black folks are not allowed to have positive positions about our bodies, first and foremost, but also the ways that fat liberation cannot be obtained if it means that we have to work sort of in tandem with a movement created around prioritizing and showing up for thin people. So that's where I land with that. And I think, the girls just got to stay mad about it because I'm not changing on it.
I'm not mad about it. No, my critique of mainstream body positivity has always been that it fails to recognize that existing in non-normative bodies that do not meet white supremacist standards actually have a tangible impact on people's lives.
Right.
And
the quick little comment.
Yeah. And it simply just doesn't do enough to acknowledge how that dehumanization is specifically a part of anti-fatness and anti-blackness, and that like all of this body terrorism is rooted in white supremacy, and it's rooted in upholding a police state that demands obedience and adherence and alignment with a specific standard and idea of what a body should be, what a body should look like, and demands that without dissent from us. And yeah, that's been my critique of body positivity. But after having known you and worked with you since 2017, I originally had hopes that we could move the body positivity conversation closer to that, but then I realized that no, it's not going to happen. We just need to talk about body liberation and body neutrality, because the things that I want from body positivity are never going to come from it. Yeah, and it's going to come somewhere else.
No one wants it, because then that means they have to acknowledge that fat folks have a different experience than they do, instead of being able to say, well, nobody should be body shamed, and skinny shaming is the same thing as fat shaming, and blah blah blah. And it's like,
yeah,
okay, have fun. You got it.
You can have it. It's fine. I don't need.
I don't care.
Yeah, it's fine. I'll just be over here.
Right.
Okay. So while we were on that subject, at least I think this is related. Of course, you have a chapter on going beyond abolition, and my question is, what other things must we abolish before the Black fat can be free? You write of abolition in literal cages within the prison industrial complex and policing, but a world where the Black fat is free would also necessitate the abolition of gender, which I see as another cage, but that's another conversation entirely. So what are your thoughts on other things that need to be abolished?
Yeah, I think that everything has to be. I think gender, race, sexuality, literal prisons, figurative prisons, like I think nation states and borders and countries, I think all of that like has to be abolished, because all of it is a result of colonialism. All of it is a result of our subjugation. But I also think that to abolish those things means to end the world. And I think that like that becomes the point of departure for so many people, because we don't know what that means, what that looks like. And what I talk about in the book is, to me, I call it like the beyond. And that's like a very vague, I would love to like, not me, but somebody, maybe Sherronda, to write a Netflix series on that, because I think it could be really cool to just imagine and like think up. I would help out with concepts. I can do like concept design, but it would
you could be a consultant,
something real quick. But I think it would be like really fun and like to like just sort of imagine whatever that could mean and look like. And I think the Hunger Games was in text form was the closest thing we get to sort of what that means, because in that way, like race was no longer a thing and was no longer a consideration and whatnot. But then, of course, placing it on screen meant bringing in a bunch of white people and a bunch of men and all of that to create what they wanted to.
Yeah, the olive skins.
Right. Like none of that mattered anymore in the movies. But, and even that, I think still, of course, falls short. But I think for the black fat to no longer have to exist as the black fat, which is to say for us to not have to exist as our subjugated, objectified selves, everything has to be abolished and destroyed. And that means that the world too has to be destroyed. Or as Zakia Amon Jackson would say, that world, not the world, but world has to be destroyed. And if that is the case, then we have a lot to think through and a lot to imagine and reimagine, but it can't happen. I don't think it can happen alone or with one person or with a few people, because this is how you get what we get.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what that beyond looks like, but I do know that if the black fat is to be free, then everything of world, everything of this world, of the world, of world has to be destroyed. And I don't really see any other answer for that.
Okay. Well, that's good enough for me. Burn it all.
Burn it all. Let's destroy. I'm ready to go.